Hello and welcome. My name is Stephen Dickens, and I'm a senior analyst at Fututurum Research, and I lead our mainframe and open source research practice. Thanks for tuning in to what should be an exciting panel discussion. I'm joined by Skyla Loomis from IBM, Jeff Cherrington from Rocket, April Hickel from BMC, George Decandio from Broadcom. Apologies for that, George. And last by no means least, my dear friend and former colleague here, John Mertic from the Linux Foundation. Guys, let's dive straight in. If everyone can please just do a quick introduction, we'll go to you first, Skyla. Tell the viewers your name and your title, please, and let's try and keep it to 30 seconds so we can keep things rolling here.
Sure, absolutely. I'm Skyla Loomis with IBM, and I'm the Vice President of the IBM Z application platform, which means I lead a lot of our core runtimes and databases and a lot of our application modernization strategy.
Fantastic.
Jeff Cherrington with Rocket Software, recently joined with the acquisition of ASG last April. I lead all of the product management for the combined organizations for Z Systems.
April Hickel, Vice President of Strategy for BMC's business unit that focuses on Z. So we call ourselves Intelligent Z Optimization and Transformation.
Hi, I'm George Decandio, and I'm the CTO of Broadcom Mainframe Division. I'm responsible for a team of distinguished engineers and senior architects that do all the product development for our mainframe portfolio.
John Mertic, Director of the Open Mainframe Project and Program Director at the Linux Foundation. I work with our governing board in focusing on operations, business development, member management, and community engagement.
Fantastic. So let's dive straight in here. Skyla, we're starting to hear a lot more about open source, and particularly the mainframe in that context, than we did even 3 years ago, let alone 5 to 10 years ago. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I'll say I'm really excited about how much we are hearing about open source on the mainframe. I think it's a really positive development. From my point of view, I think it really comes from really this trend in the industry, right, of kind of flattening the IT landscape and really trying to have everything be a lot more interconnected, which means that the types of tools and technologies that you use, the more broadly you can use them across that entire IT landscape and stack, I think the better it is for IT departments dealing with these really complex environments. And I think this is really positive for the role of the mainframe as well, moving away from what in the past was sometimes a siloed kind of set of applications and practices, and really integrating it fully into the enterprise as a core part of a hybrid cloud strategy. And so open source being so prevalent and gaining so much momentum more broadly, I think it just makes sense that we want to apply those same open source tools, practices, to the mainframe community. There's also just so much value that you get from bringing the strength of the community together, more so than any one company or team can do individually, that it really just, makes a lot of sense, I think, at the end of the day, to really develop and expand that community around our IBM Z and mainframe technologies.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, going to you, April, we've seen your organization be heavily involved in the space. BMC's software, CompuAir, and RSM have been involved in this project for a while now. They're all now part of the BMC corporation. What does that mean for the Open Mainframe Project community? Just really keen to get your perspective.
Sure. Well, I think that we see customers looking at how they can run and operate and integrate their mainframe into their larger strategy, whether it's infrastructure or application development. And I think anybody that's going through transformation and thinking about how they modernize and operate for the future is thinking about the role of open source. And so BMC's acquisition of CompuWare, BMC's acquisition of RSM Partners are part of a strategy to ensure that we can help modernize development, how we can contribute to the community. You see a strong partnership that we've always had with IBM. And then I think you see a non-traditional partnership as we work closely with Broadcom and Rocket towards the goal of helping customers. And open source is a place where we can come together as vendors, where we can collaborate, where we can contribute, where we can be open with each other. And in order for us to really grow and sustain the mainframe into people's, 2025 horizons, into their 2030 horizon, this sort of collaboration, open source commitment is part of our core strategy.
It's really interesting. I mean, I think even if you'd have gone back 5 or 6 years ago, having a panel like this of competitors on a common project would have been just unheard of. I mean, George, going to you, what's the Broadcom perspective? Seeing you guys doing a lot, particularly in the Zoe space, really keen to get your insight here.
Yeah, sure. So first, I agree with the previous panelists that open source is really taking over the industry. It's incredible. I saw a statistic recently that said between 80 and 90% of the code running in production on distributed and cloud systems is open source code. And it's like, well, that's a lot, but it's not that unbelievable if you think about it, right? Mm-hmm. So it's common libraries, frameworks, databases, even operating systems that the world really depends on now. And in addition to that, a lot of the tools that the developers use behind the scenes are open source as well, or to that, from the IDEs to pipeline orchestration to test frameworks, they're all open source. So from a Broadcom perspective, our strategy has really been to try to bring all this power of open source to the mainframe, to allow the mainframe development teams to leverage open source and the tools that open source has to make them more productive.
I mean,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, George. Sorry to cut in there. Carry on, please.
No. So it's not just like a code reuse point of view, but it's really a skills reuse point of view as well, right? Because if you can make the mainframe as easy to approach, to develop for, to run pipelines on as it is in the cloud, you get it more approachable by more developers. Gaining skills that can touch and program on the mainframe is much easier. And that's why we have really endorsed the Open Mainframe Project, because that's what they're all about. They're about opening up the mainframe. And it's the reason why Broadcom has donated heavily to Zoe and continues to donate heavily to Zoe.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Zoe there, George. I mean, I know, Jeff, that the team at Rocket's been involved with Zoe from the get-go and the inception. What's your perspective, particularly? Maybe take us there, if you will, into the Zoe space.
Well, it's terrifically gratifying to have the opportunity to be involved with this, in part because of the leadership role Rocket's been able to demonstrate, and even more so in the incredible relevance of developing this ecosystem for the mainframe. The mainframe is a critical part of infrastructures and enterprises around the world, and the costs, the risks of trying to move off of it are just so great. There has to be a way to keep it vital. And this is a critical contribution for that. As I look at mainframe data centers around the world, I see more and more young professionals stepping forward. And these young professionals are, one, predisposed to look for these types of capabilities, these open source opportunities with any technology that they work with. And even more importantly, they need that so they can become productive and effective quickly. You put that together, we're setting the stage for the mainframe to continue to play. It's absolutely critical role in ensuring high-speed, online, highly available processing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%. I mean, John, we've heard the vendor perspective here from our other panelists. I know you've sort of taken a leadership role in the mainframe over the last 4 or 5 years. Where do you see us? What's the Linux Foundation perspective here?
It's hard to think about open source actually without thinking about mainframe, because everything we see today in the modern open source movement and the free software movement comes from the mainframe community. It comes from 1955 with a group of professionals trying to figure out how to use this fancy IBM machine, getting together in a room in Los Angeles and starting that whole concept of open collaboration. It's things that have been built into these communities for decades and handed down to each new generation that starts to get involved. And if we look at really where it's at the modern state here, we have Linux coming to the platform in the late 90s. We have Zoe really bringing open source to the ZOS world in 2018. And we're seeing that engagement just really start to grow. This community has it in them. They've always had this spirit of collaboration in them. And within the constructs that open source and the Open Mainframe Project and projects like Zoe have provided, it's really connecting that and bringing the commercial vendors in as well. If we look at Zoe just from the numbers, in the 3 years that Zoe has been an open source project, there's been 35,000 commits since then. 1,000, right? The velocity, over 300 different contributors from multiple organizations around the globe. That is just a really striking sign that this community is ripe for this. It's interested in this. They've brought new projects and new efforts into open source as well. And I think this community, you know, when I talk to people in mainframe, they're always thinking about, how do we hand this off to that next generation? How do we make sure this continues past our time? And that is really in the heart of where we're after. The community wants sustainability, and we want sustainability for the community. We want to see this as something that goes another 65, 75, 100 years. And that's the sort of legacy that's starting to be built here.
I think it's fantastic, John. You mentioned some of the commit numbers. I mean, we'll try and get those and put those in some of the links here. I think that breadth of community engagement, I mean, vendors talking about it is one thing, but just from a vibrancy of the community, those 300 committers, the sort of tens of thousands of commits that you talked about, we can throw as much marketing dollars as we like at this, but those are the real numbers. You know, commits talk in the open source community. So I think those are really powerful. So, I mean, that was really good perspective there. I think let's try and transition now. What I'm keen to try and drive for the sort of second half of the conversation is some of those big industry trends and really frame the mainframe within the context of those. I'm going to go to you first, Jeff. Security. I mean, I'm covering this space. Every analyst is talking about it. All the press are talking about it. Security, and specifically cyber attacks and ransomware, they're just front page news every day. The mainframe's rightly seen, I think, by the industry as a highly secure platform. Where does it fit into the discussion?
So certainly, Stephen, you know, I've spent most of my career dealing with enterprise data security, largely with the mainframe. And even as we talk about open source, as we talk about our initiatives with the Open Mainframe Project, there are some principles that have to remain in place to make not only the mainframe the most secureable platform, but to maintain it secure. It's a matter of configuration, and that extends also to any open source offering that's used with the mainframe in any capacity. It must remain under the control of the primary mainframe security server. It must observe appropriate SAF protocols. And in terms of using it on this system, which is almost universally the primary system of record for the most sensitive information in the enterprise, it needs to ensure that it is compliant with current best practices, things such as single sign-on, things such as multi-factor authentication, handling appropriate encryption protocols. And what we've learned from open source from time periods even predating the Open Mainframe Project is having open source is the very best way to ensure that the code that you're producing is secure, because those peer evaluations are the purest test to make sure that what you provide is safe and secure.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and kind of maybe a slightly different way than people think about it. Just because it's written in an open source methodology, you shouldn't make that mental leap and think it's less secure as a result. I think you mentioned a really strong point there, which is that peer review and throwing your code out into the wild. It's not even within the constraints of your own organization and your colleagues. It's truly out into the wild. I think that's a really key point. And Skyla, I mean, to pivot from security, let's talk about how DevOps is changing and how that space and development is changing. We've seen supply chain hacks become a thing in the headlines recently. You know, we hear of Agile, we hear DevOps, we hear CI/CD pipeline methodologies. Where does the mainframe fit within that overall landscape?
I mean, I think it's absolutely critical and very incredibly 100% possible to apply all of these practices and approaches to mainframe applications. You know, I think similarly, sometimes people, you know, as Jeff was saying, that on security, people think, oh, open source isn't secure, when in fact it's actually the most secure because of the nature of how it's developed. Similarly, with practices like Agile and DevOps, people go to the assumption that, you know, it's less in control, it's maybe sloppier, you won't be able to ensure quality, when in fact actually the opposite is true. When you practice Agile as it's intended to be, and you practice DevOps and have thorough CI/CD pipelines with automated testing in place, and you're incrementally moving small pieces through that you can validate each piece rather than huge things that are so much more complex and so much bigger in scope to try to validate and ensure the quality and everything of, you know, it's actually a lot easier and more effective to have that quality, to maintain that stability, to have that lower risk, and to really, you know, have that diligence through an Agile process. Personally, in my career, you know, even in areas when I've worked before the mainframe and now on the mainframe, like Agile has been something that I'm very, very passionate about. And, you know, really kind of how you drive that transformation. And, you know, I've done it, you know, within IBM on our mainframe teams, right? Some of our oldest runtimes, you know, pretty much all of our teams have gone through Agile transformations. And we're working with our clients to do the same thing. And, you know, we're seeing, you know, even banking clients, regulated industries, right? We have a client in a bank in Europe, and they used to do big bang releases twice a year, right? That doesn't work for business agility. It's high risk. You know, everyone's like on pins and needles about if it's going to work. If it doesn't, you're trying to roll it back, and, you know, it's like a needle in a haystack to find what the problem is. But now by investing in a CI/CD pipeline and Agile approaches, they're actually doing 10 releases a day sometimes of their applications, right? So this is real. Clients are really doing this. And all the tools, many of them open source, are available to accomplish that. So, you know, I'm very passionate that Agile and DevOps is a really positive thing and absolutely possible and really well suited to the mainframe.
I mean, that's a huge transformation. Once every 6 months to 10 times, you know, that type of frequency. I mean, I think if we'd have said that in the mainframe context 3 years ago, 5 years ago, you'd have, you know, there'd have been a shock and a sharp intake of breath in the room from various people in sort of ops roles. But I think that's really the power of these tools and where these methodologies are taking us. I mean, absolutely. April, I know that the BMC team's been doing a lot in DevOps, AI ops, and bringing those to the mainframe platform. Where are you guys seeing the trend going?
So we believe that customers are really on a transformation journey. And I'm going to give you a sneak peek of a couple survey statistics from some research that we do. So at BMC, we do research on the mainframe every year. We have about 1,300 respondents, and it might be useful to step back and think about the context, and then I'll get to your question, I promise. But if you think about what Jeff said, and you think about what Skyla said, and you're thinking about why is DevOps important and why is security important and why now on the mainframe? Here's a statistic to help you understand that. So 86% of extra large shops, that's shops with greater than 50,000 MIPS on the floor, are reporting an increase in MIPS and their growing workload. And if you think about the mainframe population at large, 92% of them are stating publicly in their survey response that this is a platform for them of long-term growth. So what's happening? So on the front end, there's a lot of change happening. Banks are creating digital banks, whatever industry you're in, you're disrupting, you're becoming more agile, and that's driving a connection to and participation of more transactions, more data on the mainframe. So if you think about that, you've had operationally resilient practices on the mainframe. You've had controlled development releases in building applications. That's been history. But for your future, with more workload, with changing demands, with more agility, with all the digital disruption that we have, you've got to go faster. And the way you go faster is, as Skyla described, you move to an agile DevOps release practice. You get integrated, as everybody has mentioned. So your mainframe is integrated into that practice. And then what do you do operationally, right? You can't just continue to manage operationally as you have done in the past. You don't have the same workloads. You have more connectivity. There's more integrations coming in. You're moving faster. So you really need to apply machine learning and AI, and that's really under the construct of AI ops. So AI ops is the evolution of operations on the mainframe, just as we see DevOps is the evolution of application development on the mainframe. And the tooling that enables this, allows customers to drive faster and achieve, quality, maintain resilience, etc. So I just think this is part of the natural transformation. And you can look in other areas of infrastructure, you can look in other areas and see where the value has been realized. And the mainframe is no different. And I think if you tie this back to the thread on open source, you're not going to do all of these things in a silo, and you're not going to do it all with proprietary software, right? You're going to look to the open source community. You're going to look to collaboration across vendors. You're going to look to the ecosystem and participation with customers. And the open source community is a place which really helps drive that innovation and realize those advances.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I think just the nature of having what previously were competitors on a call like this, so strongly collaborating in the community, I think just speaks to some of your points there, April. I've worked for CA as it was back in the late 90s, and the thought of me collaborating with an IBM back then would have been unheard of. But I think just that huge power of the community. George, want to move to you. We've managed to go, 23 minutes without mentioning the pandemic, which I think is probably a record for a panel or a discussion. I saw some really interesting statistics about Disney and their launch of Disney Plus. They had a 5-year business plan and they had a 5-year growth plan. I would say Disney's a pretty well-run company. They saw an acceleration of their 5-year growth into 12 months because of the pandemic. And I think that digital transformation timeline that everybody's been on has just been collapsed. We've all gone digital. We're all now consumers. There seems to be a package delivered to my house by Amazon sort of every 10 minutes. Where does the mainframe fit within that overall digital transformation and that accelerated timeline?
Well, yeah, I feel like we've all sort of been digitally transformed because of this pandemic. As you said, we're doing a ton more online than virtually, and that's increasing the demand, like Disney had, to create better customer experiences quicker. So in order to compete better and faster, they have to leverage the data and processes and teams that they already have, within their walls, that they don't have time to staff up, right? So as we all know, mainframes are where most of businesses' critical data is stored, critical data and processes. So leveraging the mainframe as part of these new digital experiences is absolutely key. Traditionally, the mainframes have been sort of a closed walled garden, and they required special tools to develop and operate. But as we've discussed here, many of the panelists have discussed that's changing. We're making it much easier to get into the mainframe. Mainframes being opened up with RESTful APIs. The same, you access mainframe data the same way that you access cloud or distributed data. There's no difference. So developers don't have to do special things for the mainframe. And another thing, these new digital experiences and features that are getting added onto websites, and they're all backing transactional traffic up to the mainframe. We had a bunch of financial customers that we deal with in Broadcom, and they've told us that the pandemic has increased the number of transactions that they got each month, some of them up to 4 times. And the mainframe, through all of this, was able to scale both horizontally and vertically. They were able to handle those transactions, that uptake in business without a glitch. I think that COVID and this pandemic are really making customers that are entrenched in the mainframe really appreciate its value. They see the quality of service it provides. They see that they are able to get data out. And because of this modernization and opening up of the platform, it's played a very important role in the digital transformation during this pandemic. And I believe it will play an important role for many years to come.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting as we talk to customers, not being able to get hands into the data center to bring on more infrastructure, having a platform that's built for scale, that's really easy to sort of turn on as transaction volumes grow. I mean, I've heard that multiple times. So, I mean, I think the platform's well placed from that perspective. I mean, turning to you, John, I mean, you guys at the Linux Foundation are very humble, but it seems like open source has won. You can declare victory, get out the streamers and throw the party. When it comes to this pervasive model for software development, where does the mainframe fit in that landscape? We've heard the vendor perspective here from the panel. Kind of where does the Linux Foundation see that?
So it's always really interesting when I talk with someone in mainframe who's been around a long time, and I talk about a modern tech trend like containerization or scaling, things like that, and you talk about it like it's a novel concept, and they tell you, geez, we did that 30 years ago. I always find that very amusing here, but I digress. What we're starting to see now is a recognition sort of by the mainframe community of where the forward-thinking enterprise is going. The forward-thinking enterprise isn't buying from one vendor. They're buying from a multitude of vendors. They see their infrastructure as a competitive advantage for them, because if they buy the same thing that their competitors have right off the shelf, they're just as good as they are. So they're seeing their infrastructure as a way to enhance how they do business, engage their customer, and just be much more of a responsive organization. And they're not looking at that through one lens. They're not looking at that through one technology. They're driving edge computing. They're driving cloud computing. They have multiple different levels of stacks and tooling that they're using. And with that, the conversation has changed from a mainframe or to a mainframe and. And that has really been something that we have seen with the open source, even driven within the Open Mainframe Project, is it encompasses that idea. How can we have mainframe and these technologies working together? How do we make it so that, that increase of MIPS that you're seeing, April, built upon that other areas of the business are able to tap into this valuable resource that has been just underutilized in so many different areas, right? And, building even off of a few other things that were said there, April and Skyla talking about the concept of DevOps, and really that becoming a much more, central focus. And we start to see the parallels because we see the mainframe community engaging in the central DevOps conversation, but the DevOps open source conversation, with groups such as Jenkins and the CD Foundation that are really driving a lot of that thought leadership forward. We're seeing those pieces to come together. George, talking about digital transformation, certainly a lot of it is around practices. And one thing that we've seen, and I've actually even seen within Broadcom specifically, is really the growth of strong open source practices and open source program offices, and the concepts of inner source. Some of these things we've seen a lot in industry before. Mainframe has been much more traditional as they've approached software development. Now we're seeing a lot of these new concepts and new ideas, maybe not new for other parts of the industry, but ones that are coming into here and being embraced in such a large scale way and really helping, drive down some of the barriers that might exist. And, Jeff, speaking about security, this is something that's a top of mind thing for a lot of our foundations, especially those that are in regulated verticals. And, one half, of course, is just security on the machine and security in the infrastructure. But then we also start to look at software supply security. How do you know where you're getting your software from? How can you validate? And some of those are the attacks that have been the strong ones that we have seen over the past couple of years, Colonial Pipeline, and so on and so forth there. And it's really interesting because the Open Mainframe Project, with the projects we host, and especially Zoe, we spend a lot of time thinking about that. We make sure that we're building security first practices into how these communities work, which is exactly what you spoke to, Jeff, of having that peer review, but also having those first practices in place, building software bill of materials for all of the projects here at the Open Mainframe Project, being able to understand where the lineage of this comes from. That's what ends up building sort of the trust. And that sort of talks to that bigger picture that you're going after, Stephen, which is sort of your original question. Where does it fit in? It's hooking in right all over the place. And it's becoming such a central function. And I'll leave you sort of with this one thing. And there's a very predominant community in open source and a big maintainer for that community. And one of the comments that they made is, when I get a commit from someone in the mainframe community, I know it's of high quality. So there's an expertise that is also recognized here that is really brought within this community.
I think I know the person you're talking about, and he may have been interviewed by me when he was setting it. I remember back to that, and I thought it was a fantastic comment at the time. It really speaks to the quality of the code that's committed by the representative organizations we've got here and the wider community. My role here is to keep us on track, keep us moving along. We've gone through our structured questions. We've all played nice. We've all had our time on the mic. What I want to do now is just really sort of freeform a little bit, get some final comments to really sort of give you a chance to bookend the conversation. I'll go to you first, Skyla, so apologies for picking on you first. But really just keen to get – we've covered a lot of ground and a lot of topics. Anything we've missed, anything else you think that is vital for our viewers and listeners to be sort of taken away from this conversation?
Yeah, I think we've covered a really great range of topics and the landscape here. I would encourage everyone listening to this to really kind of reflect on, to what extent is your organization, aligned with some of the things that we've talked about and the trends, and, looking at Agile and the security of open source and the types of transformation that you need. And I think, one aspect around transformation that maybe isn't always covered as much, but I think is really critical, is that, this isn't just about using new tools and technologies. It's truly a cultural transformation, right? And, the people on our teams, on each of your teams, you're going to be changing the way they do their job every day, right? And that's going to be, kind of a personal sort of impact that, as you drive this types of transformation for the business need and for what we need, having that kind of like empathy and compassion with your team and working through with them, what does this do to their job, to, how they feel, and addressing it, right? And I think if you do that and are thoughtful about it, you'll drive, a much more successful change and transformation and get to the end results a lot faster, right? With folks bought in and coming to the table to help drive this. So that would be my last thought.
Yeah, I think you make a fantastic point. I mean, you all represent software companies. We spend a lot of time talking about the tools and, look at my widgets and look at how things work. I think what gets missed in a lot of that conversation is the human dynamic, I'm going back to your example you gave a few moments ago, Skyla, around 2 drops a year to, multiple drops a day or a week. Yeah, the technology's got to be there to support that. The processes, the development and operations supports infrastructure's got to be there to support it. But probably the biggest part of that project was the people change. I can imagine. So, you make a really interesting point. Jeff, I'll give you the same opportunity. And anything that we talked about that we maybe didn't cover or that you think is interesting for the listener?
The thing I would offer to the listeners is, as informative as our opinions and conversation may have been here today, what's much more important is what we hear from the customers. And one of the most gratifying things I have is when I sit down across from a senior executive, someone who's managing director of mainframe infrastructure for a global bank, and unprovoked, they ask me, which of your products are Zoe certified? What are you going to be able to deliver through a Zoe user experience? Because this is critical for me in terms of making sure that the mainframe infrastructure remains vital, remains staffed with individuals who are excited and engaged in the work that they're doing. And it's something that I look for you to deliver to us if you want us to continue to be your customer. It's the word of the market that much more strongly than the word of any of us on the vendor side that should weigh here.
It's really interesting. John and I were in the room when Zoe got launched at Share. I think if you'd have looked back to that and said that comment was going to come, 3 and a bit years later, almost 4 years later, I think we'd have all been surprised, that a customer would proactively ask you that question is just testament to the success of that project, I think, in my perspective.
Absolutely. So.
April, I'll give you the same opportunity. Any sort of comments or thoughts you want to share before we sort of bring this home?
Sure. I would like to say that I just encourage our listeners to think about a move to action. And there are a lot of different ways that you can make an incremental change that delivers a lot of value. Understanding the availability of open source through the Open Mainframe Project, taking a look at how you can take a step towards a DevOps integrated pipeline by understanding the integrations and options that are mainframe inclusive already out there. There are Jenkins plugins. There's a lot of things you can do to get started. Taking a look at your operational practice and, really determining if the mainframe needs to be in a silo or if you have the right integration capabilities in place to connect it through automation, to connect it to AI ops. I just think it's important. You can't stand still on the mainframe. What worked yesterday is not going to future-proof your business for the future. And you've really got to think about your API strategy, your integration strategy, moving to DevOps, moving to AI ops. As Jeff pointed out, reviewing your security. The realm of security is not just access and identity management. You've got to think about, zero trust. You've got to think, how this integrates into security orchestration and automation practices. So I just say to all of our listeners, you've got your own initiatives, you've got your own digital strategy. Just take a look at the mainframe and take steps towards these transformations. And with enough steps, you'll find yourself there.
It's really interesting. You talk about getting involved and action, and I think we sort of default to the developer or the operations. I think for me, it goes broader than that. I've never written a line of code in my life. I'm probably the person on this panel that hasn't. But I've been involved in this community since the get-go. You can go on and be a proofreader of documentation. You can go and be a mentor in some of these projects. You can get involved in the Open Mainframe project if you're not technical. If you're not a coder or you're in a development role, and I think that gets sometimes lost. So I really like your point there, April, about getting involved. It's broader than just the developer and the operations team. Georgia, I'll go to you next. Anything you'd want to share?
Yeah, so I'd like to agree strongly with April. I think there may be people that are listening to this panel discussion who are, not transforming their mainframe. They're sitting still and they haven't adopted DevOps, and doing that seems insurmountable, right? It's just so much work to do. And internally, I can speak for Broadcom, but I'm sure many of the people on this call we've had to go through these transformations ourselves as well. And the key, and I believe April said this, is don't stand still. Just pick something. Pick integrating a new IDE or automating 1% of your tests and putting together a pipeline on your mainframe. Integrating if you already have a mainframe pipeline, try integrating that with your distributed or cloud pipeline. It's just getting going, getting started, and asking for help. Broadcom, we like to partner with our clients. I'm sure most of the customers or most of the vendors on this call would like to do the same with their customers to help you get started. We've all been through it. We know sometimes it can be insurmountable, but as we've been talking about, there's a great community here which can help you get started and be successful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the point, if I was to summarize up there, George, is do something and get started. Whatever that something is, pick.
Because what happens is that success breeds success. You start getting momentum, and you can celebrate those successes, and it gets contagious. So that's what we've seen anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think that's true. And the other thing, that George and I have witnessed, and I'm sure it's the same for everybody, is that there's a lot of people within these organizations who are doing these things. And even within your own organization, as you go on a journey, pick DevOps, pick AI ops, and start doing these integrations, you probably have a lot of internal resources which are already on this journey with you. And so I think it really, that collaboration internally with your vendors, with open source, with the analyst community, brings everybody forward.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree. I mean, John, you're my final person to go around the horn to here. I know you're going to bring us home fantastically. Anything else you'd want to share with the listeners?
I listen to the comments here and the thoughts, and it really comes down to, people, culture, and making movement. And, I really couldn't agree more with that. And, you all here at a great event, and you're going to be hearing a lot of talks around this here. I mean, our keynoters focusing these topics. They're getting into these adjacent technologies. Even sessions talking about experiences and things like that. I'd encourage you just to build up this wealth of knowledge. Use some of the things that you're hearing, the advice you're hearing from these executives that are very, very tenured in this space, and take it and put it into practice. And, know that a lot of where, if I look at other industries and as they're sort of going through a journey of just not even open source, but just open culture and moving forward, it all starts with the first action. It all starts with a win somewhere. It starts with something. And I just really want to echo what everyone else is saying along those lines.
Yeah, I think get those early small wins, celebrate them, and build from there. I think that's a fantastic way for us to wrap up. Yep. Well, this has been fantastic. It's been a pleasure to be your host. My name's Stephen Dickens. I'm from Fututurum Research. I've had the pleasure of hosting a panel here with Broadcom, Rocket, BMC, IBM, and the Linux Foundation. I think we've had a fantastic 46 minutes now, talking about open source, DevOps, security. So there's a fantastic range of sessions during the Open Mainframe Summit. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be around for some questions. So if you've got some questions, please feel free to ask those. And we'll look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks very much for joining us.